There are about 44 days and 6 weeks until the UCAT testing period starts, so you're probably starting to get more and more into your UCAT preparation. In today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys 2 tips for each and every subtest for you guys to use so that you can improve in your preparation and your test taking skills. Hi everyone and welcome back to the YouTube channel. If you don't know me, my name is Emil and I'm a first year medical student currently studying at Monash University. So what that means is that exactly 1 year ago, I was probably in the same position you are in right now, in fear and terror of the UCAT. Luckily for me though, my preparation went well and I scored in the 99th percentile on the UCAT. So hopefully today I'll be sharing with you guys my 2 top tips for each and every subtest on the UCAT so that hopefully I can pass on my success to you guys. If you want to see how much I studied for the UCAT in general, or if you want to see my specific guides for each of the UCAT subtests, do check out my UCAT crash course playlist, which will probably come up on the screen right about now, and you can click that link and see all of my videos about the UCAT. This video in itself will be split into the 5 subtests, so I'll put timestamps in the description box down below and also on the screen right now, so feel free to skip to whichever subtest you'd like to see my tips for. Without further ado, let's get into my first set of tips, which are for the verbal reasoning subtest. The first tip I have for you guys is that you need to slow down your reading speed and read at a speed at which you can actually understand everything that you're reading. I think a major trap that people fall into in verbal reasoning is that they try to read too fast because they hear words like you need to scan for keywords or you need to scan the passage, and they try to read too fast and then they end up not understanding anything that they read. For this reason, my main tip for the verbal reasoning subtest is that you should slow down your reading and calm down a little and take the time to read the passage so that you can actually understand what you read. The worst thing that can happen in verbal reasoning is that you scan through a passage after reading the question and then you have no idea what happened in the passage or what happened in the question, and then you have to read the whole passage again but slower just to understand what's going on. Since time is so important in the verbal reasoning subtest, that's why I say that reading the passage slowly at a pace that you can actually read the passage while understanding it is the best thing you can do to improve your marks. My second tip for the verbal reasoning subtest is that once you've found a relevant part of the passage, you should read the sentences around it. The reason I give this tip is because sometimes while reading or scanning, you can actually miss important details searching for the keyword that might be in the question. By reading the sentences around the keyword in the passage, you can definitely learn a lot more about the question or even just find the answer to the question in general. This is because often finding the keyword might lead you to what seems to be the answer, but then the information in the sentences around it might actually lead you to a different answer, revealing that it was actually a trick question. So those were my 2 tips for the verbal reasoning subtest. I hope you guys can use them to avoid the most common mistakes people make in this subtest. Now moving on to decision making, my first tip is that you should always make sure to read the stimulus very carefully. As opposed to verbal reasoning, in decision making, you should definitely read the stimulus in full before you even look at the question stems. This is because in decision making, the question stems can often be far too confusing without having the context of the stimulus to look at. When you read through the stimulus really carefully in decision making, it means that you'll understand what's going on in the stimulus a lot better, and also that the question that you read will make more sense to you and you'll have a better idea of what the question is asking and where you need to look for that information. In my opinion, this is the most important tip you need for the decision-making subtest because the questions can often be so misleading and lead your mind to go into loops and make your brain hurt. Grounding yourself in the stimulus means that you can actually go through the information that's presented in the questions and actually process that information so that you can get the question correct. Now, my second tip for the decision-making subtest is that you should definitely distribute your time to the questions that need it. Because there's such a wide variety of questions in the decision-making subtest, what this means is that sometimes questions like the syllogisms can take up to 1.5 minutes, whereas strongest argument questions shouldn't actually take you much longer than 20 to 30 seconds. Now, because there's such a huge disparity in the amount of time that you'd need to answer each of these questions, that means that you need to be really active in doing the easy questions as quickly as possible so that you can spend longer amounts of time on the yes or no drag and drop questions. Now, in the quantitative reasoning section, my first tip is that you should never spend any time thinking about the data. What this means is that I think often people in QR tend to look at the data, feel a bit overwhelmed, and try to make sense of it without actually applying any of that information to the question. What I think is really important in quantitative reasoning is that you straight away turn to your number pad and start adding things together multiplying, and making calculations based on the information that you're given. Once you read the question, you should immediately have an idea of what calculations you need to do to get the answer. Don't waste any time trying to look at the data or trying to understand why you might need to do those calculations. Just do them and do them as quickly as possible. That leads me on to my second tip for the quantitative reasoning subtest, which is that you should get really familiar with using the number pad and be as quick as possible with it. The number pad really is so important to the quantitative reasoning subtest, especially because you need it to answer most of the questions to a certain degree of accuracy. My main piece of advice in this tip is that you should get very, very familiar with using the number pad, and you should be able to use it quickly and accurately without fumbling or without having to look down at your keyboard. I think this is the biggest thing because, as you know, many people know how to touch type, but a lot of people won't know how to touch type on the number pad. If you haven't learned this already, this is definitely a skill you should learn for the UCAT because it will speed you up quite a lot, and it will also mean that you're more accurate on the number pad. You should also definitely get very used to using the memory functions on the calculator and knowing what each of the buttons do on the function. As a quick extra sneaky tip for you guys, I'll tell you that the quickest way I found to clear the calculator without having to move your mouse and press the C button is to just press 0, enter 0, which I found clears the calculator and allows you to do the next calculation without worrying about it. Now for the next subtest, abstract reasoning, my first tip is that if you're overcomplicating a pattern, just click A, flag, and move on. In abstract reasoning, you'll often get patterns that you wouldn't be able to find even if you had 5 or 10 minutes to find the pattern. Because of this, you should be really wary of spending too much time on one pattern in the AR subtest, especially since it is so time pressured. Because some of the patterns are simply quite ridiculous to try and find in the time you have, if you can't get a pattern, don't be afraid to just select A for all 5 of the questions and to move on. If you have half of a pattern, just use that to select the answers you think are right, because often you'll get more than 3 or 4 out of the 5 correct. My second tip for actually finding the patterns is that you should eliminate the possibilities in the patterns first before you try to propose pattern ideas. So what this means is that if you notice there are no correlations between the number of sides in the boxes, you should eliminate that, and that you should do this first rather than trying to propose ideas for patterns or just fishing for ideas for patterns hoping that one finally hits. Using the process of elimination with these patterns definitely helps you to have more method to the madness that is AR. Often if you don't try eliminating patterns first, you'll be stuck just proposing pattern ideas and trying to think of a pattern that will work for the box rather than systematically working through the box to find a pattern in that way. Now for the final subtest, situational judgment, my first tip is that you should try to find the issues in the scenario the first thing you do. When you get any situational judgment scenario, there will be certain issues that pop up in the scenario. Because there are issues that pop up in the scenario, make sure you identify them so that you can actually consider them when you're thinking about the answer and whether it is appropriate or important. When you understand what's actually in the scenario, putting the actions or considerations into the correct answer option becomes much easier because it's a lot clearer what they're actually referring to and dealing with. My second tip for the situational judgment subtest is that you should actually try and imagine the best case scenario of what could happen in the scenarios. What you might actually find is that imagining the best case scenario for some of these situations will actually help you to put the answer options into perspective. By imagining the best case scenario, you can actually realize that an answer option you thought might have been very important actually becomes just important, because in the best case scenario, the person might have done something else entirely. Using your imagination in these scenarios and also understanding the key issues in the situations will allow you to do much better on the situational judgment subtest. That wraps up my 2 tips for each of the subtests on the UCAT. I hope you found them helpful and that you can implement them in your practice so that you can improve your results. I tried to be as pragmatic and practical about these tips as possible so that you can actually apply them to your practice rather than providing you guys with some airy tips which are kind of obvious but don't really help at all. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like, comment, or subscribe, as it really helps the channel grow. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram and I'll be sure to try and answer your questions when you get them. Do share these videos with some of your friends who might be doing the UCAT as well so that I can share my knowledge and help them as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.